Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to Awakening Our Democracy, Racial Justice Outlook, Possibilities of Progress in 2021 and Beyond. My name is Ixchel Rosal, and I am the Associate Vice President for Student Life within the Office of University Life. We have a lot to talk about today and a great panel of experts who I'll introduce in a moment. First, I want to share a quick word about University Life. Today's event is part of the Awakening Our Democracy series, which focuses on timely domestic and global issues through conversations with thought leaders, advocates, journalists, and scholars. Through programs like this series, University Life seeks to provide the university community with opportunities to explore issues of justice, equity, and citizenship. University Life is also a student life hub for information, resources, events, and initiatives that support inclusion and belonging, health and well-being, sexual respect, and community citizenship. Turning to our program for today, our thanks to all of you for joining us and to many of you who submitted questions in advance. If you have questions during the discussion, please submit them through the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of your screens if you're on Zoom. If you're watching by live stream, please send us your questions via email at universitylife@columbia.edu. This event is being recorded and will be posted on University Life's website within the next week. Tonight's conversation will be a moderated discussion for the first segment, followed by a Q&A session. And also a quick update. Unfortunately, Midwin Charles was not able to join us tonight, so we will miss her, but we are fortunate to have an incredible panel with us today. I'll be brief in my introduction so we can save time for the meat of the conversation. Our moderator tonight is Professor Nina Alvarez, who is the CBS Assistant Professor of International Journalism here at Columbia. She is also a journalist, documentarian, and video photographer who has reported global breaking news and feature stories for the past 25 years. Lurie Daniel Favors is the Interim Executive Director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College within City University of New York. She is an activist and attorney with a long-standing commitment to racial and social justice and a radio host on Sirius XM's Urban View Network. Eric Tang serves as Director of the Center for Asian American Studies and Associate Professor for Black Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. A former community organizer, he focuses on race and urban social movements, including studies of post-Katrina New Orleans and refugee communities in New York City. And finally, I'd like to introduce my colleague and co-host for this event, Dr. Dennis Mitchell, Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement and Professor of Dental Medicine at CUMC. For the past 30 years, Dr. Mitchell has sought to dismantle structural inequality in the academy and in the practice of dental medicine. As Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement, he leads the university's efforts to increase the diversity of Columbia's faculty through targeted recruitment, faculty grants, and pipeline programs, and provides faculty development programs and other resources to help all faculty thrive. Please welcome Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Ixchel. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. As Ixchel said, I'm Dennis Mitchell, Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement here at Columbia. And I'm looking forward to this afternoon's conversation. As we pass the anniversary of the COVID-19 lockdown and approach the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, many of us have been reflecting on the events of this past year. With a new president and presidential administration at play, a COVID vaccine finally at play now, it is natural to have renewed sense of hope and to be relieved that our lives might finally be returning to normal. But today, we ask you to consider how good was that normal for the most marginalized of us: Black, Latinx, Indigenous people, Asians, Muslims, immigrants, and people living in poverty. Normal is not what we need. We must ask more of ourselves and of each other, both as a university community and as a nation. We cannot be complacent. Structural inequality can only be dismantled with a vigilant and sustained effort. Today's panel will examine how individuals can move from conversations into action to address the systemic inequities that plague our society and our communities. I look forward to this conversation, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Professor Alvarez.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Really important words today as I think about the events of just this week. I want to start our discussion just thinking open with the horrific murders in Georgia that included 6 Asian women. The chief of police referred to the gunman as having a bad day. And the previous day, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy led a delegation to the border, claiming it was worse than a crisis and that people from Yemen, Iran, and Turkey are attempting to cross the US illegally. And then he cited conversations with Customs and Border Protection agents, quoting them as stating that they had captured people on the terrorist watch list. And so I want to ask our panelists, is there a connection between these 2 events? And if so, what is it? And I'll ask Eric to start.
So the question is, what is the connection between the 2 acts? Well, or 2 articulations. I would say that the connection would be white supremacist governance. And even if what happened in Atlanta was not in itself an act of US statecraft, it very much is an articulation of what an individual understands US statecraft to be doing and saying about its named enemies within the United States. If I could just be more concrete about it, whether or not the investigators determine that this is a hate crime or not, what remains true is that the shooter, the murderer in this instance, is picking up messages, is responding to a text, a moment in which he is informed that Asian people are accessible in this way, if that makes any sense, accessible to white supremacy, accessible to its goals. And mental instability isn't an alibi for that. In fact, mental instability comports with what many people think and do in response to their environment. And so I would say that what we saw in Atlanta is an articulation of white supremacy. And what we're seeing at the border is an articulation of white supremacy. Of course, that one being more directed by US governance.
Lurie, would you like to weigh in?
I think that was really well said. And I think what I would only add is that the same thing that connects the statements that were made at the border to the incident in Atlanta is the same thing that connects Thomas Jefferson to his ability to claim a position still within the American mythology as a phenomenally great leader and man, despite the fact that he engaged in the acts and behaviors which we are all well familiar, including one owning people and including sexual assault against young girls that he owned, and then keeping the children born from that engagement or that assault enslaved. There's a common thread through all of these, which yes, is white supremacy. And it is a commitment to the idea that if you do not live and occupy a white body, not only do you not have right to life and to live, you don't have the right to live in this space or to occupy the space that perhaps geopolitical circumstances that are beyond your control have placed you in. I'm thinking specifically of young children showing up at the border who literally are there, many due directly to the negative outcomes, perhaps unanticipated outcomes of American foreign policy. And so the idea idea that there is a group of people who occupy the proper place at the top of society, and that it is their burden, often called the white man's burden, to rule over the darker peoples, is a common thread that we see throughout the entirety of American history. And I think what we saw yesterday, particularly the statements made by the spokesperson from Cherokee County, Georgia, who is the spokesperson for the police department in that precinct, who says that this murderer, and I'm going to do what lawyers are not supposed to do. I'm not going to say alleged. He has admitted, he has confessed that this was his act. And to say that this murderer had a bad day really does symbolize for me just how far some folks in our society have come, or just how committed they are to preserving that same approach to governance, that same approach to determining who has the right to life, who has the right to equitable access to resources and political power. They're one and the same, and we are just now seeing another version of that.
But we're also, these are also narratives about brown and Black people being the problem, right? We have, Black people are criminals, Mexicans are rapists, Asians brought the China virus, Muslims are terrorists, and Trump supporters are cheering them on. And these are the narratives that make incarceration and deportation and violence and murder against these groups not only acceptable, but almost the thing that you must do to fix the problem. So how do we shift this language? How do we shift these narratives? Is it possible?
Well, I'm just going to jump in, Nina, and say that what I'm seeing is it's this use of white supremacist language or rhetoric to weaponize, whether it's geopolitical issues or COVID-19, infectious disease, global pandemic, to weaponize it against people. And once weaponized, now you run into these challenges of rampant murder. And that is what I think we've been watching now for 5 years, actually, if you really look at it. It has hit a peak clearly in this past year, but it's been 5 years of weaponizing white supremacist language and rhetoric.
Would any of the other panelists like to add?
Yeah, I guess by shifting the language, Nina, are you asking whether or not or how all of this might go away?
Well, that would be amazing if we can do that. I think really the question is, it just, as Dr. Mitchell points out, this has been a drumbeat over the last 5 years, right? It's been relentless. There is a identified culprit of all of that, someone to blame for all of America's ills, even a pandemic, right? There's a group that is clearly responsible in the view of the white supremacist logic. Right. So, but it just seems, and I'm actually going to kind of dip into my next question, which was, there's a lot of talk about a reckoning, right? A reckoning over this past summer with Black Lives Matter. And, I think in our discussion the other day, as we were preparing for this talk today, you brought up a really great point, which is a reckoning for whom? And it seems like among people of color, there's been a reckoning that's been happening for quite some time, right. And that perhaps white Americans are catching on or joining, but this language is still persisting, and this mob that we've seen that articulates this speech against groups is also there and very present, and not going to go away very soon, it seems. Right. So it's like the cat's out of the bag. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So how do we deal with this?
I think we might begin with actually having better theory about what exactly is happening. Meaning, when we talk about the way that Asians are targeted now, the ways in which African Americans are criminalized and how Latinx folks are at once criminalized and also, regarded as the alien subjects to be kept out. The question is, what is being achieved in these acts, And what I teach my students first and foremost is that racism is not ignorance. It's not about being misinformed. It's actually highly knowledgeable, meaning racists always know what they're doing and what they want, even when they engage in the most unsophisticated forms of it. It's not senseless. And what's happening in these moments is that goals are being achieved. We can call it nationalism, toxic masculinity, economic inequality. They're being achieved by scapegoating or sacrificing these subjects. So it's not that these people have just some irrational hatred. They're after certain goals, and they say to themselves, these subjects bring me closer to my goals. If I do this to them, then nationalism is assured. Masculinity, whiteness, all these things are assured. And so the question is the goals. If you want to change this violence against these subjects, then change your goals. This is why I think it's so interesting. I'm getting media calls all day today. Well, what's the solution for this? You're asking me what the solution is for a problem that you created. You're asking me a solution for your own goals. You tell me what the solution is. And maybe it begins with you changing your goals. Because to be honest with you, I don't think this goes away until that does happen. You can't solve what happened in Atlanta any quicker than you can nationalism, masculinity, and whiteness. You want Atlanta to go away, make those things go away. And I think that's where we might begin to talk in an honest way about what needs to be done if we have a better theory about what's actually happening.
I think that the idea of changing the goals is so fundamentally important, but I also think that it's not just are white people who benefit from racism, who benefit from white supremacy, whether they agree with it and are aligned with it or not. It's not just a matter of whether they're going to change their goals. And I say they in the broadest sense, meaning, yes, the card-carrying members of the Klan, and I have no expectation that they will. But I also am talking about people who consider themselves allies, perhaps even white people who participated in protests last summer, which I often call the summer of the Great White Awakening, when there was just an enormous outgrowth of protest and activism. And, I've spoken with some philanthropic leaders who are from the African-American community who call it the season of press releases and the season of commitments, Emmy award-winning performances about the philanthropic and corporate commitment to changing those goals, right? And I think the reality is that we are never going to get to the fulfillment of what America could be so long as the requirement for us to change is that white people change, because I don't know that that can happen. I don't know that I shouldn't say it can't. Anything is possible. I don't know that it is going to happen unless there is some deep-seated intentional commitment on behalf of allies or white people who recognize the harm that believing you are a part of a superior race creates, not just for yourself, but for others and the rest of the planet. But I think that there's also a question of what are we, the people who have been traditionally marginalized and oppressed by that perspective and outgrowth? How are we going to change our goals? How are we going to change the way we are working and collaborating with each other? Are we going to move towards collaboration for those of us who have had communities that have been sort of at odds with each other? And I think that we really have to have this conversation in active real time, because the reality is the promise of America is never a promise. It's something that can be removed just like that. We've seen how the last 4 years have literally undermined every single safeguard that the racial justice, social justice, civic rights community has really depended upon. And when you consider the fact that we've only had an integrated society for 57 years. And I mean that quite literally. And I often say this and people are kind of surprised, but the reality is the Voting Rights Act passes in 1965. That's the first time that Black people and other non-white people get access to the ballot. That's 56 years ago. So if you know someone who's 57 years or older right now, and we all do, they're literally older than one of the pinnacle laws that that opened the doorways for integration to happen in this country. They're older than integration. And when we think about that, and when we think about the fact that for 346 years before the Voting Rights Act, we had active, intentional, wanton use of violence to command control over the bodies of non-white people. When you talk about old habits being very hard to break, racism, white supremacy, being able to reach for violence to solve your problem, your perceived problem, as easily as you might reach for your cell phone and know that you're going to get away with that. That is a deeply American thing to do. And we see that in our foreign policy, we see that in our domestic policy. And so I think the question is, yes, are white people going to do the necessary work of changing? Or will the democracy suffer its end because of their unwillingness to do so? But part of that question is also, how are we within the communities of African descent going to engage differently with communities of Asian descent and vice versa? How are our Latin brothers and sisters, many of whom are of African descent, some of whom are, how are we going to reconfigure how we're dealing with issues of race? How are we going to reconcile that for many of us, a pathway to success in this country has been an embrace of some elements of white supremacy, or at least white approximation and being as close to whiteness as we possibly could so that we get the benefits thereof? There are questions that we all really do have to ask. And it's not just within the province of white people. And I know that's not what was being suggested, but I'm just stretching that point to say, we all have to do things a lot differently if we have any hope of this thing actually working. And considering what happened the last time we had a sort of a Reconstruction era following the end of the Civil War, we saw how white nationalist violence, and that was also a time that was accompanied with increased access to the ballot. We had the passage of the 15th Amendment. Black men at that time were enfranchised in ways that they had never been before. And what did we see? We saw white nationalist violence that eradicated the Black vote and essentially shut us down for 70 years following the end of slavery. Right now, we are in the midst of what some are arguing is the end of the current Reconstruction era. And once again, white nationalist violence is being used to bring about that end. And so these are the brutal conversations that we simply have to have. And what we have now that we have not had in the past is someone like me can not only be a racial justice attorney in the community, but now I have a platform and a microphone, and we all can have this Zoom conversation where we are unapologetic in our assessment of the illness of whiteness and the harm that it is causing. And we have the ability to speak truth to power in much bigger and broader ways, which also means we have the ability to collaborate in much more effective and powerful ways.
Is it going to make a difference that we have the most diverse Congress in history, that we have more people of color in history, maybe double of what we did 20 years ago? Does that make a difference in trying to change the goals, but also finding ways to actually achieve them? Does who's in power matter?
Yeah, that's the interesting dichotomy that is America, right? And the piece that makes me hopeful is just that, right? When you look at this diversity that we're beginning to see at the leadership level, which means that our citizens are coming out to the ballot. When we felt the most threatened, came out to vote to make sure that we had growing numbers of diversity within our leadership. And yet at the same time, we saw the first president of the United States be prepared to, take it all down with him, culminating ultimately in January 6th. So it is a dichotomy that I think that we are challenged with. I want to stay on the side of hopefulness that we will find our way past this, but still live with the fear of what we saw show itself on January 6th, all at the same time.
Well, but also beyond the violence, right? And this is a question for all of you. There's over 250 bills at the local and state levels that have been introduced to suppress the vote, mainly targeting African Americans, but also other groups, right? And this is just since January. So obviously there's a lot of movement happening. And so what's the response? What's the response at either the grassroots level or in any other organizing sense? And maybe I'll throw this to Lurie in terms of organizing and having a response. After seeing Stacey Abrams just, captivate the imagination of Black voters in Georgia, and now it's all looking like there are very, very serious efforts to undo all of that work.
And I think the sad part about that is the MO. It's the modus operandi for how white supremacy works. The reality is that studying a group of people whom you are oppressing and determining how they are seeking to advance justice and then formulating ways to stop that advancement is literally just the cycle of progress in this country. I think the fact that we not only have voter suppression, but you have voter suppression that is designed to make lines longer. And then there are now laws that are coupled with this voter suppression that is going to make lines longer that also say while you're waiting in line, you can't pass out food. So we know it's going to cost your grandmother 7 hours to cast her vote, but please don't you dare give her food or water while she's waiting. That would be a violation of the law. And so what concerns me not so much is about what's happening in Georgia, but the fact that this has been copied and pasted throughout the entire nation, even in places where there was no question about the sanctity or the validity of the vote. Iowa had a perfectly normal election. There was nothing stupendous about it. It went off without a hitch. And yet they have decided, wow, even though our elections went off so well, there were no concerns about voter fraud, we too are going to make it more difficult to vote. And so for me, the issue is, yes, what's happening in Georgia, but the fact that they have studied not just how we vote, when we vote. They've studied, the fact that Sundays is a major voting day for Black communities. And so they're going to shut down voting on Sunday, not Monday through Friday when white people tend to vote more, but Sundays. And I think what we saw in Georgia was particularly disturbing because it wasn't just Black voters. There was an exponential increase in the AAPI vote. Exponential increase in the Latino vote in Georgia, in Arizona. When we saw the indigenous community, the Navajo Nation showed up and showed out when it came to voting. And so what did they do in Arizona? Well, now, because in Navajo Nation, they don't have mailboxes for necessarily everyone. Everyone's not on the postal route. So people would drive around and pick up the votes for the people and then carry them in. This was a well understood procedure. Well, now in Arizona, they're going to no longer allow you to pick up someone's ballot unless you are a blood relative, which simply does not work for the Navajo Nation, which of course the Republican legislators who promoted this idea were very aware. So I think that the reality for me, just again, is that white supremacy's the best thing that it has going for itself is that it will always adjust to the new normal. And they will scope out whatever it is you little brown people and your melanated cells are doing to activate and whatever it is that you're doing to organize. And it will be able to pinpoint. And one court looking at what was happening in North Carolina with their voter suppression efforts said that not only were they were pinpointing with surgical precision. When a judge is telling you that you have been surgically precise, that is saying that not only have you said, wow, we're going to make up this issue called voter fraud, we're even going to create a commission for it under the Trump administration, and the commission will then have to be disbanded because there will be no voter fraud found. But we're going to surgically, astutely study everything it is about this community that we want to continue to occupy this bottom rung in society, and then we're going to legislate around it. And I think that that really is the reality of Americana. And if we as members of communities of color are not willing to organize and have that same level of surgical response, yes, to what is being pressed down upon us, but also having that same level of commitment to surgically organize and collaborate across racial lines, across the lines that have been typically used to keep us separated, then we are in for another 402 years of what we have currently seen. We are going to have to change because the status quo is certainly not going to.
Eric, can you speak to the divide and conquer strategy that has been so central in the last 4 years? I mean, Lurie, you're bringing up an excellent point, which is we need to build bridges across communities and work together. But is that happening? Where is it happening? And if it's not, how do we make that happen?
Well, I think with the example that Lurie brought up about Georgia, I do think it's happening. I do think that there was a really broad coalition that came together and that it's not getting as much attention as it should be getting. The question for me when we talk about divide and conquer really isn't about communities of color. It's about why the moderate Dems won't let the Democrats who have the House and the Senate and the executive use their power. Why so apologetic about the use of power? It's an honest question. Let's go back to the question that we had before on the table, which is, will it make a difference that you have people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in high places now? Well, we had a president who ran it for 8 years, who's African American. And during that time, his administration actually apologized for a report that it put out there, which was rigorously conducted, that showed that the biggest threat in terms of domestic terrorism was white supremacy. But it had to, it felt, withdraw that claim and apologize for it. My question is why? I mean, it's an honest question. Why did that happen?
Right. Well, and also, yeah.
And just last week, Joe Biden, is talking about the attacks on Asian Americans, and he states that the attacks and the scapegoating is un-American. I get where he's coming from, but it actually is quintessentially American. Because if we look at what's happened over history, this is a repeat. And the fact that you say that it's un-American is an obscuring of the past. So again, I ask, why do that? Why are we not taking this moment to do something different? And ultimately, I think that that's where the real divide and conquer is happening. It's happening in the fact that there is political power in places that can make change, but in my view, it refuses to actually wield that power.
That is one of my biggest challenges with this current administration. And I'm so glad that you said it, because I think you hit the nail right on the head. It is absolutely American to divide. This is literally what the nation was founded upon. I was talking earlier today about the fact that our policing institutions were literally founded on the protection of property. One was the protection of the property that white colonists had stolen so that the indigenous community didn't take it back. Two was protecting the property of Black people from running away. Every single institution that we have in this society is at some way tied in part to the preservation of the status quo. And so when someone with, quite frankly, the goodwill that someone like a Joe Biden has garnered, he's been able to really help turn the tide in a lot of areas in conversation, or at least begin that turn, to say that this is not American when we know actually it is. And not only is it a bit disingenuous and Pollyannish in an unnecessary way, but it also undermines our ability to effectively get things done. When you have elected officials who are so moderate as to choose neutrality in the face of oppression, and you all should know this quote, if you're choosing neutrality in the face of oppression, you have in fact chosen oppression. And when we have moderate Dems, and this was actually one of the reasons that a number of folks within the activist community raised some concerns about Merrick Garland as the nomination for Attorney General. Nothing wrong with Merrick Garland as a justice, but we have a tradition that says if you are in a position of power that is going to have to adjudicate or address issues of injustice, and you yourself have never been victimized by that injustice, there is a question about your ability to fully commit to what rectifying that injustice will look like, particularly if remedying the injustice might also have to cause some uncomfortable conversations. And so when we're talking about whether or not the diversity within Congress is going to make a difference, I'll again just look to history. I think history is a phenomenal instructor. And we had a phenomenally diverse Congress, relatively speaking, right after the Civil War with the passage of the 15th Amendment, when there were thousands of elected officials who were Black, who were placed into office at the local, state, and federal level. And all it took was a coordinated effort to change the law. All it took was a coordinated effort to be more committed to violence than to the rule of law. And you will have some history books that hopefully will never have to write about this again, but have written about the fact that the violence in that time, the violence that took place before Birth of a Nation was even shown out of the White House in 1915, the violence that took place was so massive that it left the floors of some of the state houses where these Black elected officials had been ensconced. It left the floors slick with their blood. That's a direct quote. So the use of violence to upend the rule of law has been phenomenally successful, both in times when we have had an all-white Congress and an all-white Senate, and in those times when we have had diversity. And I think, who is it? Congresswoman, that's Ayanna Pressley, who said that for her, January 6th felt ancestral. Every Black person who heard that and who was aware of it, we all knew exactly what she meant. Of course, it was ancestral because it is the same thing. And so, I often look to South Africa as a rule when I'm asked questions about demographics, because demographics, I do not believe, are destiny. You can have a beautifully diverse mosaic of people, but if power is held by those who are willing to use extreme and extraordinary violent means to maintain power, well, then the people who are being wielded over, or that power is being wielded over, have a different set of questions that they have to ask themselves.
So I think most people in communities of color I think there was probably a collective deep exhale when Biden won, right? I mean, obviously, however, you know, like we've been saying, does it really matter that he's in charge now? What are you seeing in his leadership so far on the border, even in his statements regarding Asian Americans and violence against them? I mean, remember, we had Obama was the deporter in chief, Clinton, mass incarceration. What's going to be Biden's legacy, whether he likes it or not, from what you can tell in these early days? I mean, granted, this hasn't even been 100 days, but just from what you are seeing on the border, for example. You may have other examples. Eric, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I think that it is facile and probably incorrect to say that there is no difference, and that you know, we're dealing with a one-party system in America, and therefore we, you know, should all be cynical. Of course not. You know, I think optimism is an important part of what we're doing. I think where the difference really makes a difference has to do with how we organize, right? How we take advantage of the opportunities that are afforded by the breathing room given in the change of administration. You know, if we being, you know, the people who think about how change is made on the ground in communities, right? If we don't do everything we can in the next few years to fully maximize those opportunities, then I think that we have failed. I also think that liberal multiculturalism, which this seems to be a return to, has to really recognize its limitations, has to recognize what hasn't worked over the past 50 years. And if it simply sees this as a return, right, to diversity that doesn't address inequality, to conversations about inclusion that don't deal with the implicit violence that communities are dealing with, then I think we will be back in a situation where there will be a resurgent reactionary movement in this country that is going to take advantage of, you know, cancel culture, quote unquote, or, you know, the culture wars, right? Because we haven't done more to change fundamentally how diversity deals with inequality, how diversity intersects or inclusion intersects with anti-violence. A repeat of what we've already done will bring us back, I think, to a resurgent reactionary moment. And that, to me, is where I wonder what this administration is about. Is it really only interested in a return to things we've already done? If I could be more blunt, is the Obama administration the height and the limit of this administration's ambitions when it comes to race and class? And if it is, then I think we might have a problem.
I think we're going to have to help President Biden succeed in spite of himself. I've always been very honest that he was not my first pick. So I say this as someone who voted for him, recognizing the need that we have, but also recognizing the limitations that a Biden administration might present. I think there were phenomenal things that took place under President Barack Obama. And I think there was a lot of short-sightedness and the inability to really grapple with and understand the depth to which white supremacy was going to reformulate itself and do everything it could to make him a, quote, one-term president. I'm concerned. I'll be perfectly honest. I was not very happy with what happened with Neera Tanden, who was a woman of color, an Asian woman who was apparently taken to task for tweets. She was nominated to be, I believe, the chair of the OMB. And because of her mean tweets, you know, we have no tolerance for mean tweets in this country. Because of her mean tweets, she was not allowed she did not move forward in the nomination. I understand she withdrew her nomination, but she was not as vigorously defended as I would have thought some might have wanted to see. I'm concerned about the appointment of Vanita Gupta and the fact that now they are going after her as someone who is too much of a mean brown girl, also a woman of color. And, you know, Kristen Clark, who is being nominated for I believe it's a deputy position in the Civil Rights Division. These are all women of color who have been rightfully critical of racist acts and of previous administrations, and even some folks who are within the current administration. And so to see that there has been sort of a lackluster defense, or what I would call lackluster, obviously people can disagree, of these women who are being criticized for mean tweets, but really for holding people's feet to the fire in a way that made people who traditionally benefit from privilege uncomfortable. I'm not optimistic. And so I think that, I'm reminded of at least, I can't remember if it was I don't remember what event it was, but there was a lot of reporting that came out of a particular event under the Obama administration where some activists were pressing him on some things. And he basically said, you're going to have to make me do this, which is a similar refrain that a number of presidents have said, okay, I agree with you. You want these 5 things you're protesting. Now you got to go out there and make me do it. What that comment is often designed to convey is that even if I agree with you, I need the public pressure so that when I make this decision, I am actually going to be able to have the cover of saying, well, the people demand it. I am of the opinion that we are going to have to demand, we're going to have to be the people who are demanding for President Joe Biden, because I think that for him, a return to normal would be phenomenal. It would be perfectly acceptable. Sure, with some tweaks here or there. But again, as I mentioned with Merrick Garland, if you are not someone who has grown up or who has lived with the repercussions of the oppression that your society engages in, and in fact, you benefit from it, I am concerned about your ability to be as committed to undoing the systems that allow you that benefit because you have never suffered the harm. So I think that what we saw last summer with those protests, I can tell you 1000% right now, I have been a part of years-long efforts to engage in various changes in social justice. Civil rights law 50A, which is protecting police officers' disciplinary records. We have been fighting about 50A for years. You know what happened after a couple thousand people took to the streets on a regular basis? 50A got repealed. We have been fighting for police reform. For defund police was just a crazy activist with big hair conversation for a very long time. Once those thousands of people took it to the streets and made it a real conversation, granted, the NYPD only got a haircut, but that haircut was significant in their budget because it was not ever going to happen had the people power not shown up. Now, I don't like to call for boycotts and strikes and all these things all willy-nilly. I think we should talk about these things and have a plan and a structure. But I do think that what last summer showed us was that so long as we are on the right side of the issue, that might not be enough. But if we're on the right side of the issue and there are thousands of people who are willing to take it to the streets, granted, we were all pretty much, jobless or stuck at home or working from home, and we had the ability to do it. Circumstances allowed for a different type of activism, but that activism helped make the difference even in a state like New York, which is supposedly predominantly Democratic, supposedly. So I think that no matter what we might hope would come from a President Biden, we are going to have to push him there. I think the filibuster is going to be a major issue. Kristen Sinema, Joe Manchin, hugely problematic in their unwillingness to even consider that perhaps voting rights should not be subject to a 60-vote majority in the Senate. So these are just things that we're going to have to press on. We're going to have to be extraordinarily vocal on. And what we cannot do, I'm going to wrap up after this. What we cannot do is what we did during the Obama administration. I recognize and understand why we did this. Many of us did this under the Obama administration, but it cannot happen again. There was a need to protect him, Michelle, and the girls psychologically, particularly from the African descendant community, not wanting to criticize too much because, hey, he's got to get that second term, not wanting to criticize too much in the second term because, hey, he's a Black man. There is a limit to what he can do. And how dare you expect this one Black man to resolve racism for all of America? I get it. We can't do that again. We have to call things things. We have to be able to speak truth to power, no matter who is sitting in that seat. It does not matter if Biden was your first choice, if you are a bleed blue or die type of person. We have got to recognize that the position of president is a position that could be occupied by anyone. And if we are not committed to ensuring that there are certain bedrock principles of democracy that are going to be upheld, i.e. passage of HR 1S1 for the People Act, because that is going to be what helps undo the harm that is coming in the state by state voter suppression.
Let me jump in right here because I think you're also kind of bringing us back to another point, which is our goals don't line up.
That's right.
And keeping momentum going, right? Those were extremely special circumstances, right, over the summer, and polls have shown that white support of Black Lives Matter, which was at an all-time high over the summer, has dropped significantly. They've kind of are getting their vaccines and moving on. And then we had corporate America also with their press releases and their promises, claiming they're going to invest millions in communities of color. But the goals still are disconnected, right? So I read a Pew poll the other day that showed that there's a really big gap between the perspectives of Black and Latinx and whites regarding race as a consideration in jobs, in educational opportunities, that should be a part of the consideration. But whites reject that by and large. So how do we come together? And I think I want to ask Dr. Mitchell about this, because I imagine that this has been a conversation at Columbia as well, how to respond to what has been a grievance of communities of color, which is access to education, higher education.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the places that we see two things play out. Institutions, many, moving towards support of affirmative action programs at the student level, of scholarship opportunities at the student level, increasing access at the student level. So it's a good thing from that perspective, but it's also the place where you see a battle of those on the political right who are against that, are fighting it in the courts. And we've been going through this now, getting close to 25 years of battling over and over and over again. And we don't really expect to see that stop, because there has been success ultimately in moving the nation, as you were talking about Black Lives Matter, even the support of affirmative action, that has waned significantly over time, and has definitely flipped in the opposite direction when it comes to our white citizens of this nation. So, institutionally, as from Columbia's perspective, we have been targeted at this for quite a while. We're blessed in many ways to have a university president who, in his former presidency at the University of Michigan, successfully battled this at the Supreme Court level for affirmative action. I have great pride that Columbia has been the first of our peers to move forward and publicly announce resources that were targeted even at faculty diversity, trying to move that needle forward. And we are actively in that. That is my portfolio. I felt that last summer, it was a painful summer. First, we started in fear with the pandemic, and then May 25th hit, and that murder of George Floyd, it just threw us reeling. Myself personally, was horrid, painful, terrifying, and at the same time surprising, and at the same time not surprising that it occurred. But after reeling for a while and figuring out what do we do, I thought we were positioned nicely at Columbia because we had already had a portfolio targeted in these efforts. So we could, instead of starting from scratch, as many of our in the academy had to do, we had a portfolio that was already moving in this direction. We had frameworks in place, and we could just concentrate on accelerating that work. We could, in accelerating the resources to make sure that we could move it forward. We came up with some creative ideas around cluster hiring, but we could ultimately just accelerate the work and concentrate on something we talked about a little bit earlier, the difficult conversations that we just don't want to have. And so we spent a great deal of time. We created a mini institute on anti-Black racism. We will continue to expand that. It's clear we need to move a conversation forward on anti-Asian racism. We have it's clear that we need at the academic level to have the scholarly conversations, the difficult ones that our nation will not have. And must I say, in mixed company. So you see same company having these conversations at home. It's family and groups, social groups, educational groups, but you don't see us having these conversations together. And that's what we've been trying to inspire, these kinds of difficult conversations, along with the hardcore resources necessary to move hiring forward. So we've been pretty pleased that we were positioned so well to continue that work.
Thank you. I want to take some questions now because we have quite a few coming in. How could xenophobia against the AAPI community be better addressed within a racial justice framework?
By that, I guess the question suggests that Asian Americans are often left out of the racial justice framework. Is that how I should interpret that question?
Here's another question as well. How can community organizers and universities work together to denounce hate crimes and discrimination towards the AAPI community? So I think, if taken together, I think that has actually been a charge, right? That has been made, that Asian Americans actually have been left out of the mix, that the concentration of racial justice work has been in Black and Latinx and immigrant communities. So yes, I think that's how I would interpret the question too.
Yeah, I mean, this moment will clearly be a good litmus test for what universities say and do. I know that my university, University of Texas, I believe is central administration is preparing a statement right now. And, one of the things I wonder is whether or not it will explicitly say that on its face, what happened in Atlanta was racist and misogynistic. I don't know that it will. And I guess I'll say in turn that if we want to be more effective at the university, we should call things what they are, not based on what the legal threshold for a hate crime is, but on what we know historically. Because after all, that's what we do at the university. We give, names to things and phenomena. So why would that be so different in our statements? So I think that's the first thing. And I think the other thing that we might want to do, if I could interpret the questions in my own way, is recognize that the people who are catching racist hell in the Asian American community are disproportionately the newer immigrants and the lower income ones, the people who are most vulnerable. So there is a immigration/class dimension to this that needs to be addressed in a very real way. I do believe that the Asian American community as a whole is afflicted by the psychological and emotional damage that this, era of this pandemic of racism against it has unleashed. But the day-to-day impact, those who are being harmed on the ground, as it were, are the most vulnerable. And that's, of course, because racism is always cowardly. But we have to deal with that particular aspect of it as well.
If I could just add to that, Nina, that I think that our universities, the academy in general across the nation, we just have to stand up and call this out. It is and inspire those conversations to make it clear where we stand. And I think that I expect to be able to see that. We saw some of that begin across other areas in the academy last summer against anti-Black racism, clearly, but I think we're going to need to do the exact same and work with the social justice organizations as well to do that, so that we're coming at it from every angle or a societal angle. One of the challenges I think that our Asian brothers and sisters have had is that so much of the social justice work was always, is rightfully so, was targeted towards inequities and inequalities. And the demographic wasn't representative of Asians as having the same level of inequities and inequalities as Black and Latinx communities. But clearly now we've added physical, emotional, and mental harm to that as this has been weaponized now over the last few years. The virus in particular has been weaponized. It started actually before the virus because there was economic weaponizing language against the community, but then the virus just sort of tipped it over. We're just going to have to call this out and work together against it. And I just want to put in a statement that next Tuesday night, we're going to begin that panel discussion here at Columbia. We are hosting, along with Ellie Hossama, in our music department. We'll be working with panelists to have that initial conversation on anti-Asian racism. And my team is on here. They'll put that in the chat for anybody interested in these early scholarly conversations, and we'll have many more. So please take a look at the chat if you're interested in being a part of those conversations. We're going to start that Tuesday.
And if I could just add real quickly around this question of solidarity, I think it's also important that we recognize that there are different kinds of racisms. And that's part of how white supremacy works. So like, it's not as if we could argue that, you know, Asians and African Americans and Latinx folks and indigenous people are all experiencing one monolithic thing called white supremacy. What we are experiencing is different articulations of it that, when put together, make the whole. So Asians are, you know, excluded, they're rendered invisible, right? Their pain is always in question because we always doubt whether their status is people of color. Well, that is part of how white supremacy works in this particular way. African Americans, it's different. It's highly visible. It's criminalization. It's a questioning of Black humanity that comes from a different set of practices. And for indigenous folks, it's dispossession. And it's important for us to really understand that. And if we're not going to take the time to understand racial specificity, then I think we're not going to get very far by way of solidarity or strategies for group action, if that makes sense.
And Lurie, I want to come back to something you started to say earlier, and you were starting to reference legislation and HR 1 and there's the stimulus bill, there's HR 1. How do you see these moving the needle?
I can't remember the point I was making.
Hopefully. I'm
sorry. Could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, I think, there's, and actually I'm going to read a question that is sort of along the lines here, but, the question is really more about tangible steps that students should be taking to help move the needle. But I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts on you were saying that Biden needs our help, right? He needs our help to really move forward on this anti-racist agenda. And that doesn't just involve like looking for ways to reduce white supremacist violence, but also in real economic and growth in communities of color, as well as obviously the voter suppression piece, the electoral vote piece. So do these legislative initiatives stand a chance to really make this kind of progress, and do they stand a chance to actually pass in these in this current legislative makeup, this Congress? And do they do enough?
They don't do enough, but they do what they can do considering the limitations under which we are living. And when I say we have to help Biden be successful, I'm not talking about for Biden's legacy. But we need him to be successful for us.
Right.
I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. Sometimes these things get misheard in the Zoom world. So I need us to be successful. I need Biden to be successful because I want my communities to survive. And I need us to have a shot at continuing to alleviate enough pressure so that those of us who are on the ground, whatever that might look like for you, are still able to effectively do the work. HR1 is not enough, but it is phenomenally better than what we have right now. Does it stand a shot on actually passing? I think that depends on how committed someone like a Joe Biden, who has lengthy relationships with a Joe Manchin, and I only call his name because he seems to be the one that is most discussed. Are you willing to do what needs to be done in order to force your members to get in line? Chuck Schumer, I'm looking at you. I want to know, what would Mitch McConnell do if this were a reverse situation? It would already have been passed. So I think that, again, my concern about the commitment to ensuring that what is necessary is actually done, I think is sometimes differently experienced if you are not someone who has experienced that harm for yourself. So I'm going to need Chuck Schumer to dig deep and to figure out how to get those votes together. I need the whip to start whipping votes. I hate that term. I think it's so laden with so much racist terminology, but I need the votes to be whipped together, because I know that if the shoes were on the other foot, this would be happening. And so the sort of sometimes democratic equivocation that we have, that, well, we want to be fair, we want to support the First Amendment, and yet we're faced with all of these negative outcomes. We really don't know how to deal with it. I need some non-equivocating decision making. I need some commitment to the principles that Black lives actually do matter, and that's an okay thing to say. I need some commitment to the principle that says Asian people are not a model minority, and that is a really problematic trope. I need some commitment to the idea that says Latino is not a race, it is actually a distinction. I need some commitment to the idea that all of us are living with these labels that none of us created, but we're all dealing with the negative outcomes thereof. And so I think that HR1 must pass. It absolutely must pass. Or I should say now S1, because it has passed in the House. If we do not have voting rights protection, you can kiss environmental protection, goodbye. You can kiss educational equity, goodbye. You can kiss Fight for 15, goodbye. Because if we do not have access to the ballot, that is going to determine whether or not we can do any of the other things that we want to do. And even if some of this legislation were to get passed without S1 being passed, if we do not have that Voting Rights Act in place, as soon as the Republicans are able to reclaim the House, God forbid the Senate, everything that has been done will be undone. We saw that right after the Obama administration was concluded. They were able to literally undo most of the legacy that many of us were too concerned about reputation to do more than raise a whisper about. So the question is, how much are we going to be willing to force the issue? And dare I say, look at the lessons we learned from last summer and see just how amazingly, powerfully, smoothly things seemed to move once there were thousands of people who were in the street. The same way that we had thousands of people in the street for George Floyd, I need people to be willing to go to the street for voting rights. I need people to go to, because voting rights is going to help us determine, if we have access to the ballot, that will help determine who is policing in our streets. If we have access to the ballot, that determines the policing policies that all of us are going to be dealing with. So I just think that until we have the ability to secure the ballot, any other potential advances or progressive movements that are made are temporary at best and fleeting at the very worst.
And along those lines, I just want to, ask a question that we don't necessarily have to answer, but it's a provocation. Why aren't we going to see, or will we see, thousands take to the streets? Because, we've kind of assumed or observed that there's been a lull in the movement, but we haven't really addressed why that is, and what the consequences of that lull are. And then as educators who work for, large research universities, what do we think of the fact that so much of the movement is comprised of students? And do we reward or punish students for being part of these movements? I mean, that's, not to throw my own question into the Q&A, but that I think is something that we need to be held to account for. Like, how do we think of our role as educators and, or professionals in general as it relates to broader movements? So I just leave that as a provocation, not as a question to be answered necessarily.
But I think there are some answers to at least the second part of that question. Though it's always been the students, whether you're talking about the divest movements from South African apartheid, whether you're talking about the end of colonialism throughout the continent of Africa, or the revolutions that we saw take place throughout Latin America. It's always youth power. I mean, I have vivid memories of taking over buildings and sleeping in churches overnight when I was in college. I can't do that now. I've got kids, a husband, and a mortgage. Like, so it's just, the reality is just different. When you are a student, the world is still fighting for you and still rooting for you. Stay students as long as you can. I miss being a student. But when you are a student, the expectation is that you are seeking out ways of changing society. And so I'm hopeful that students will continue to carry this on. I think to the first part of the question, the presumption about why we're not, I think that rapid fall off when it comes to what people thought of Black Lives Matter at one point was everyone's, donation baby. Everyone wanted to make a donation. And then as soon as really dealing with the underlying issues within the struggle for social justice became more apparent, people fell off. Some people had to go back to work. I think one of the reasons we saw so many people, particularly so many white people in those streets, we were all at home for the most part. People could not turn away. And I think a lot more people would more actively protest if we were not constantly so busy with just our day-to-day affairs. But people were home. They had literally seen this virus, which had negatively impacted Black people to an extent that was not seen in the white community, by taking away our breath. And then this officer is literally taking away the breath of this man on TV. I've had many people who have said, had George Floyd been shot, protest would not have happened. It happened because we're used to seeing Black people get shot. We're used to that story. We've seen that happen countless times. But seeing the life squeezed from someone as he's calling for his mother who had already died 2 years prior, I think that just struck something in the mental and the national consciousness. But that striking of something was not able to outlast the really difficult conversations that come whenever we're trying to be honest about systemic change. It's very easy to go to a protest, particularly when you're surrounded by your friends, families, and loved ones. It's a lot more challenging to have that conversation at Thanksgiving with your racist aunt or your entire racist family. And if you are the one person who was at the protest while the rest of your family was poo-pooing you, it's a lot easier to protest and say Black Lives Matter than it is to go home for dinner and say, Mom, you're wrong. And frankly, part of what you're talking about is why George Floyd is dead in the first place. It's a much different.
And also Biden won, right? So that kind of just made everybody feel like, oh, okay, we're okay now. We're all right. Someone asked, we've talked about white liberalism and its support for the racial justice movement, but that may be seeing the limits. How can we continue to engage with our white allies to advance this work?
Well, if the limit of racial liberalism is, solidarity statements, is, as Dennis mentioned, everybody has some, Black Lives Matter statement to make from corporate America to the university. If that's the height and the limit, then maybe doing something else would be in order. Like, that's what I infer the question to be asking. And to tie it to what Lurie is pointing to in terms of the lull in activism, maybe it's about white liberals actually encouraging, organizing, and engaging in civil disobedience as opposed to statements. And we can see examples of that in Portland, where white allies came out and literally, were a buffer between state enforcement and African Americans. That to me was very concrete, and it exceeded the limits of racial liberalism. So that's one example.
Is it possible to actually share the same goals? I mean, in my school at journalism, we talk about diversifying the newsroom and why that's important. And to me, it's just better journalism. Like, that's the only reason we need to diversify, is because to do good journalism, you need a diversity of perspectives. So is this applicable to a larger society, that it's just a better, if we are treated equally, isn't that just better for everybody, even white people?
No, it's not better. And the reason it's not better, I don't know if you were directing this question at me. I'm sorry. My daughter just came in, was having a coughing fit. So my apologies. Working while Zooming from home with children. It's not better for everybody, because if you're going to create an equitable world, in a world that has been largely inequitable, somebody's going to have to give up some privilege in order for that to happen. And we often like to have this, well, we're all this, we're all people, and then no one has to lose. And well, no, if you have been scrimping all of the pie, then you're going to have to give up some pie for the rest of us to eat. And frankly, this for me reminds me of the comment that, or the idea that white people are voting against their interests when they vote for someone who might be a racist and makes them feel really good about their whiteness, but has horrible economic policy. They may have no dental care, but they've got their racism. And I say that's actually not true. They actually are voting for their interests, because white supremacy is a very valuable thing. It's priceless even. And so the idea that you as a white person are being asked to give up some of this privilege, which we all know will get you a lower criminal sentence. You're more likely to get married, hired, callbacks, jobs, mortgages are going to be better. Your interest rates and everything's going to be lower. That is a tangible benefit. And if you're telling me as a white person, hypothetically, that I have to give that up so that you can be equal, you who I have been trained throughout my entire life to see as less valuable, then of course it's not the same. And then why would I want that? So I don't need an ally. I want accomplices. I need people who are willing to be an accomplice in the pursuit for freedom. And I need you to be willing to commit race suicide. And when I say that, and it's a very loaded term, but I need you to be willing to say, I am going to sacrifice my privilege, whatever that looks like. And I honestly don't know. So I'm saying this and I don't know. But the reality is I'm going to need you to be an accomplice. I don't need you to just show up with a protest sign. And because even in Portland, it was beautiful how folks stood in front. But then the follow-up reporting was that a lot of those white people who had good intentions at those protests and were at one point using their bodies to protect Black people, many of them came in and then took over the movement that the Black organizers had been working on in a way that was very reminiscent of the traditional racial hierarchy. So, there is a real conversation to be had about just how much are white people willing to give up, and just how much are those of us who are suffering from what they won't give up willing to do to make sure that we have a right to life that is equitable and just for all of us. Those are not the same questions, and I don't think that we would all answer them the same.
Yeah, I think the minute that we begin to entertain what white people are going to be deprived of and how we manage that is the minute that we've lost.
And I think we're going to have to stop having that conversation, because if no ally agrees to work alongside people of color, if no white person agrees that they should give up their privilege, does that just mean the rest of us are just stuck? I think that traditionally our conversations sort of end at that point. And I would just suggest that there's a world where perhaps we don't need white agreement and consent and funding and support and sustainability in order to secure the type of freedom that we want. Perhaps we should focus on the collaborative spaces that we all can create with each other, and whomever will come, let them come. But I think that I would like to see us challenge ourselves within our respective communities to imagine and then get about the business of building what we have imagined could be for us, whether white people agree or not, because I don't know that we would get a critical mass that do.
We don't have a whole lot of time for questions left, but so I'm sorry for those of you who sent in questions and that we won't get to, but I will ask this one, which I think I'd love to hear all of you weigh in on, which is, what are the investments that institutions, private, corporate, educational, most urgently need to make to undergird the process toward equity? So if we could start with Eric or Lurie, and then I'd like to have Dr. Mitchell have the last word.
So if I understand the question, it is, what are the first steps that we need to take to achieve real equity?
Yeah, what are the most important investments that institutions across the board, private, corporate, educational, most urgently need to make?
Redistribution of resources in a very affirmative way. And what I mean by that, if I can use my own kind of dog whistle terms, when I say affirmative, is like the difference between affirmative action and diversity and inclusion. Affirmative action was redressive. It was about redressing past injustices, saying we did this, it was wrong, it was criminal, and we need to redress with this. Most major institutions, including our universities, have rejected that logic. They don't believe that anything is owed for past crimes. Instead, they point towards diversity and inclusion, as a way of rectifying or redress. But if you think about it, that's inherently unfair. You don't get to get away with things that you did by saying, okay, now we're going to be inclusive. You actually have to redress the things that you've done. Here, let me give you a concrete example. If you've redlined Black people out of communities and denied them wealth, you have to redress that. You don't get to just say, okay, but now we have laws that allow you to buy houses in these neighborhoods. But what about all that happened before? And one of the things that I feel is really just disingenuous, if not cynical, on the part of a lot of liberal multiculturalism as it takes shape in corporate America, in our universities, is this idea that inclusion is redressive. It's not.
I think redistribution of resources is certainly at the top of my list. And I would suggest, people are often like, well, it's so hard to have affirmative action now. We can't consider race and admissions. And well, look at your legacy policy and replicate that for people of color. Look at all the places you're already spending money. Who are the most significant groups that are benefiting from whatever endowments, funding, whatever it is that you're aiming money at? Who's getting most of it? And then give it to the other folks who aren't. I wish I had something more scholarly, but I think that really is at the heart of it, what we're talking about. And I think it requires us having an honest conversation. Not all groups, as Eric has said earlier, and I believe Dennis as well, not all groups have suffered the same harm. So for that redlining example, if you are a part of a community of color that was not redlined, then perhaps targeted redress would not include you. And that should be okay. And we should be able to have a conversation about that. If you are a group that did not suffer the negative harm of the war on drugs, then perhaps the redress that's coming out of, for example, the marijuana policies that are now sweeping the nation, perhaps that redress should not be aimed at you. Yes, you're a person of color, absolutely, but you did not suffer this particular harm. And I think that we have to say that that is okay. We have to normalize saying that that's okay. But short of, frankly, sending your checks in another direction, a direction that they have not traditionally gone in because of the institutionalization of racism within your distribution of resource policies, write the checks.
I can't disagree with any of that. I think that the idea of affirmative redistribution is an interesting thought, and I think that it is there. The original question was around corporate America and the academy as well, and I think that we all have our expertise and on our parts of society that we play, and if it's the financial world, they have their role to play in being addressing the financial needs and redistribution along those lines. For us in the academy, we specialize in education, and so for us it's about access to that education and making sure that we're targeted with opening access to education, and also what that education is that we deliver and who we deliver it to. I think we have the opportunity, not just to our own students, but nationally and globally, to make sure that what we deliver is equitable, is historic and factual, and is not, as we often see, coming only from a Western viewpoint. I think there are lots of opportunities that we have there. And who's delivering that education, which is our faculty, making sure that we open up access for that. So I think that this is our lane in the academy, and we should lead. And I hope that that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. And I hope that our peer schools and the rest of the academy follow, because this is our opportunity in higher education.
Great, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. And I'm afraid we've got to end it here. I want to thank panelists Eric and Lurie for really, I know this was just the tip of the iceberg, but really some really interesting ideas to think about. So thank you. And I'll leave it to you, Dr. Mitchell.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nina. And thank you to the entire panel, all of you, Nina, Lurie, Eric. It was, I've enjoyed the last hour. Thanks for sharing your insights with us. Thank you to the audience for your questions. Sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but grateful they were so robust, that there were so many. And if you're engaged in this work towards racial and economic justice, please try not to get too discouraged, especially when the work is difficult. I don't know any work that is harder than this. It will be difficult. It's supposed to be difficult. So don't get discouraged. I want to end with words of President Bollinger himself, who, and these words are actually framed on my wall in my office, which I hope to get back to soon. And it says that, this work is not of the moment. It requires sustained commitment and concerted effort and the intention of us all. So we want you in this work, but remember, this is for the long haul. There are no short gains here. We're undoing 400 years of challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I also want to thank our panelists, as well as my co-host, Professor Mitchell, for sharing their time and expertise. To echo others tonight, the work of dismantling longstanding systems of inequity takes sustained effort, courage, and the willingness to listen, learn, and unlearn. Thank you to everyone who has joined us tonight to continue this critical work together. Good night.